Headlights split the trees and something steps into the beam. Brakes scream. Gravel rattles like bones in a jar. Hannah Cole gripped the wheel and said, "That was not a deer." The shape turned, tall and wrong, as mist crawled low across the road. Pine sap stung the air. The dash clock blinked and died. From the timberline, a voice said, "Hannah." It sounded like her father and not like him at all. The phone in her lap woke, then spat static. A red reflection slid across damp bark, as if eyes blinked where eyes should not be. Hannah said, "Who are you?" The trees answered with wind that knew her name. Footprints pressed the shoulder without weight. She eased the car forward, heart loud, beam shaking. The voice came closer, soft as breath on glass. "Hannah." She lifted the camera on her phone and set it to video. The dark leaned in. Something tapped the trunk twice, polite like it wanted to be let in. House lights hummed when she killed the engine, but the porch bulb flickered like a heartbeat. Hannah said, "It spoke my name," and the room seemed to lean closer. She locked the door twice. Then a third time, the kettle clicked and hissed as if it had been waiting. Her hands would not stop shaking, so she set the phone on the table and pressed record again. Outside, wind crawled along the gutters like fingernails. The answering machine blinked a single message from a blocked number. She did not press play. She whispered, "If you can talk, talk now." The fridge rumbled and went still. Somewhere inside the vents, a soft whistle rose and fell, shaping syllables that almost matched her name. She stepped closer, breath shallow, and the whistle paused like it was listening back. The kettle shut off. The house sighed. From the back hall, a floorboard bent, careful, as if someone learned how to sneak by watching her. Noah called at 1:17 a.m. and whispered, "Something is outside my window." His breath stuttered like a skipped drum. Hannah said, "Do not open the curtain. Stay on the line." She drove with one hand and kept his voice in the other. The town slid past in wet neon, empty and watching. Tires hummed like a warning hymn. On the call, a second voice repeated Noah's words a half-beat late. "Something is outside my window," the echo said. "Perfect. Wrong," Hannah said. "Who else is there?" The echo went quiet, then breathed a laugh that was not a laugh. A stoplight blinked red, then all three colors at once. The phone crackled and dropped to a crawl of static that formed her name again, Patient. She said, "Keep speaking. I am close." And the static tried to answer her with her own mouth. When she pulled onto Noah's street, every porch light snapped off in a wave, house to house to house. Ruth Hargrove opened her door before Hannah knocked, as if the knock had already happened. The old house smelled like cedar and old paper. Ruth said, "Names open doors. Doors do not always close." A radio on the shelf whispered only between stations. Hannah told her what the thing had said, what the town had done, how the lights obeyed. Ruth stared at the rug and said, "It called my mother once." She answered. The words fell like nails into a box. Outside, a crow barked in the dark and then stayed silent as if warned. Ruth slid a brittle clipping across the table. Vanishings, dates, a column of names. A note in the margin said, "Don't say it back." Hannah traced a fingertip down the list and stopped at a familiar last name. She said nothing, but the radio hiss rose and held. The bulb dimmed like a held breath. The last line on the page looked new. Written tonight. Back home, the house felt an inch to the left of where it should be. Hannah set her phone beside the tape recorder. Her grandfather left, a boxy thing that smelled like attic. She pressed play on an unlabeled reel. Wind filled the room, though the windows were shut. A younger voice said her family name and paused, waiting for an answer from the past. She said, "You do not get to have me." The tape clicked, slowed, and layered her name under itself, a chorus turning toward her. Something brushed the hall wall and stopped at the doorway like a guest who knew the rules. A cupboard hinge whispered. The recorder spun on, steady, as a heartbeat. The chorus thinned to one voice near her ear now, almost gentle. "Hannah," it said, as if asking. She reached out and stopped the reel with a finger. The silence felt heavier than sound. The finger came away dusty, as if it had touched a moth's wing. Sirens wailed behind her and died fast, like the town ran out of breath. Hannah ran the shoulder path toward Noah's porch, rain snapping at leaves. A window rattled. A voice said her name from two places at once. She said, "Noah, answer me now." A shape crossed the yard and bent wrong at the waist. The porch bulb fluttered, then burned steady like it chose a side. Sheriff Mark Dalton jogged up and said, "Step back. It is a raccoon," she said. "It knows names." He frowned, hand on holster, heart loud in his jacket. From the hedge, her own voice whispered, "Mark." The sheriff froze. He said, "Who said that?" The hedge held still, then breathed. A fence picket tapped 3 times, neat and even like code. Noah cried from the hallway and said, "Do not let it in." Glass flexed as if touched by a warm palm. Hannah raised the recorder and hit record. The tapping replied with 4 beats. The porch light went black, and something moved closer with no sound at all. The storm thinned to a hush and left the air heavy. Inside, blankets and a weak space heater drew a small circle of warmth. Noah clung to a mug and said, "It said my words before I did." Hannah said, "You did right to stay away from the window." Mark stood by the door and stared at the lock as if it might speak. He said, "I heard it say my name." The room felt smaller for that sentence. Hannah took Noah's hand and felt the shake pass into her like current. She said, "We breathe. We watch. We do not answer it." A child's drawing on the fridge showed a tall black shape next to a stick house. The shape had too many elbows. Hannah said, "When did you make this?" Noah said, "Yesterday, but I did not draw the mouth." The heater clicked off. The silence was clear and cold, as if waiting. A thin smear marked the window glass at mouth height. It curved like a smile. Power died for 3 heartbeats and came back with the wrong color. The kitchen turned sea green, then normal. The radio on the counter woke on its own and tuned to a station that spoke only names. It said Hannah, then Mark, then Noah, and paused. It said Hannah again, but with a voice from her childhood. She reached to shut it off, and the knob turned under her hand like a living thing. Mark said, "This is a prank." But his voice fell flat, thin as paper. The floor creaked in a path from hall to sink, though no feet crossed. The air smelled like wet coins. Noah said, "It is learning." The radio laughed with her father's laugh and then coughed with her mother's cough. Both gone for years. The room leaned as if pulled by a tide only it could feel. The radio voice said, "Please open the door." The knob turned again. The porch boards answered with a slow, patient step. They drove to Ruth Hargrove's cabin at the tree line, where the wind spoke in long rows of grass. Ruth opened the door slow, eyes steady, and said, "Names are doors, and doors remember the first hand that opened them." The room smelled like cedar smoke and tea. Hannah told her about the radio and the voices, about the fence tapping code. Ruth nodded as if tallying days. She said, "It does not hunt food. It hunts answers. It takes what answers." Ruth set a leather book on the table. On the first page, a rule written twice said, "Do not say your name to the dark." Hannah said, "It already knows it." Ruth said, "Then you starve it. You speak in signs, not sounds. You leave it with nothing it can wear." The stove ticked as it cooled. The wind fixed itself, then turned. Ruth said, "You will be tempted to bargain." That is the trap. The tea steamed. The room waited with them. Hannah traced a diagram Ruth had drawn, a simple ward of lines and circles. She said, "We mark the thresholds, and we do not answer." Ruth pressed a small tin into her palm. Inside lay chalk, thread, and a bell with no clapper. Mark said, "This is theater." Ruth said, "Then act well." Hannah stood, fear close but not in charge, and said, "We go back to Noah's house. We set the lines. We test it." Mark rubbed his jaw and stared at the door. He said, "If this fails, we call the state." Hannah said, "If we wait, we hand it more of us." The wind rose and pressed a branch against the window like a hand trying to learn how. Hannah pocketed the tin and the bell. She held Ruth's gaze and nodded once. The stove moaned as it cooled. Ruth said, "Do not give your name in any shape." Hannah opened the door, and night breathed in, as if it had been listening. Morning came thin and colorless. The town felt hung over from fear. At the diner, coffee steamed, and plates clinked, soft and normal on purpose. A man slid into the booth with Hannah and smiled like he knew the right words. He said, "Lucas Reed, I track weird reports for a private outfit. I believe you." The relief tasted sweet and wrong. Mark watched from the counter and did not wave. Lucas laid out a small recorder and a map with red pins like old wounds. "More C, Seishu's cues for," he said. "Pattern fits a loop around your street." Hannah said, "Noah is in the center." Lucas said, "We can move him to my place tonight." The room was warm, but Hannah's hands were cold. A ceiling fan ticked out of rhythm, counting seconds. She said, "Why help us?" he said. "Because no one helped me." She wanted to believe him. Outside the window, the reflection of the dining room smiled a half-beat late. They drove the loop Lucas marked. He spoke lightly, but his hands kept drumming the wheel like a code. He said, "It follows a 3-day rhythm: pressure, contact, pullback." Hannah said, "You have seen this before." He nodded and looked away. He said, "Once years back." It wanted a girl then too. The car heater hummed a low, steady note. The road unrolled under gray sky. Hannah told him about the bell with no clapper and the chalk lines. He said, "Ritual helps the mind, but power helps the body. I have cameras, floodlights, a generator." She wanted the steel of that plan. She wanted the old wood of Ruth's rules. He said, "You can stay at my place, safer than yours." A red tail hawk dragged a shadow over the hood and was gone. She said, "We move Noah after school." He said, "I will make the call." He smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. Ruth met them at the porch and stared at Lucas like a test. She said, "Who taught you that map?" Lucas said, "Experience," Ruth said, "or appetite." Hannah said, "We need both of you." Ruth poured tea and spoke of old winters when voices called from the barn. Lucas cut in with brand names and lumens. Ruth spoke of names and breath and debt. Lucas said, "Light punishes shadow." Ruth said, "It drinks light and wears it like skin." Hannah felt her mind pull in two. One side iron, one side smoke. Lucas said, "We stand and fight." Ruth said, "We endure and refuse." Hannah said, "We protect Noah." The kettle hissed like a warning. The room held still and listened. Lucas smiled at Noah's drawing on the wall and said, "Creepy kid art." The drawing's mouth seemed wider than before. Hannah blinked, and it was the same again. At dusk, they moved Noah. Lucas led, calm voice, firm steps. The generator throbbed in his truck, hungry and sure. In his house, floodlights painted the yard, white as bone. Cameras blinked small red eyes. Lucas said, "We are safe here." Hannah set chalk lines and the bell on the sill. The bell was quiet and brave. Mark called to check in and said, "Do not trust the new guy." She said, "Ween ye." Lucas returned with a box of cables that smelled like hot dust. Hannah saw a second phone under the router, its screen lit with a text thread full of times and names. She said, "What is this?" He said, "Client notes." The floodlights dimmed and came back. At the door, a soft knock, polite and exact. Her own voice outside said, "Hannah." Lucas' eyes flicked toward the text, then to her. He said, "Do not answer." The knock repeated the code from the fence. The bell trembled without sound. Night deepened fast, heavy as a lid. The knock returned, then stopped. The generator faltered once, then steadied. Lucas said, "It is testing." Hannah said, "So are you." She picked up the hidden phone and scrolled. A message read, "Deliver usable audio of full name. Payment clears at dawn." She said, "Who are you selling?" Lucas reached for the phone and said, "Give it back." His voice was soft and empty. The floodlights flared to white and died. The cameras clicked off like eyes closing. In the sudden dark, a voice said her name in a dozen accents, a choir of places she had never been. Lucas grabbed Noah's arm. Hannah said, "Let him go," he said. "It wants names. I give it yours, and it lets me walk." Noah bit his wrist hard and broke free. The bell rang without a clapper, pure and thin. Outside, something smiled against the glass. Silence fell after the blackout like ash after fire. The generator ticked itself empty. Hannah sat on the floor and counted her breaths until the count soothed the shake. Noah slept against her shoulder, small and fierce in sleep. Mark stood at the window and watched the yard that watched back. He said, "Lucas is gone." The words left a cold hole in the room. Hannah replayed the fence taps in her head. 3, then 4, like a question followed by an answer. Rain eased, and the air smelled like pennies and pine smoke. She saw the chalk line she drew, and the smear that crossed it without smearing, as if the smear had learned to lift its feet. Hannah said, "It learns what we teach it." The recorder on the table clicked by itself and rolled blank tape. In the white hiss, she heard another sound, quiet and careful, like a page turning in her grandfather's journal. She found the journal under the tape deck, leather gone soft with years. The first page smelled like cedar and old glue, and her breath matched the slow scratch of a dead pen line. The entry began with a winter voice. "We answered the barn, and the barn answered back." The room around her thinned to edges. Her grandfather wrote about a thing that loved the sound of names, and how it wore each one like a coat until the coat fit. He wrote, "We fed it by speaking, and starved it by refusing." She touched a pressed moth in the crease, and dust came away like gray snow. Mark said, "What started this?" She said, "A dare, a night, a gate we opened with our own mouths." Footsteps moved in memory. Hay rustled, and the radio in the now hissed the same rhythm. At the bottom of the page, a simple note waited. "Never say thank you in the dark." The ink below that line looked wet. Hannah drove to Ruth's cabin at first light, road steaming under a weak sun. The trees held still like a jury. Ruth opened the door and did not speak. The quiet let Hannah hear her own heart and the scrape of her shoes. She set the journal down and waited until the stove sighed. Hannah said, "We taught it our names. It learned to ask for them." Ruth poured tea that smelled like smoke and lemon. She said, "You know the rule now." The space between them was proof and grief. Hannah asked, "How many did we lose before we learned not to answer?" Ruth's eyes held years. She said nothing. The radio on the shelf tuned to the low end and hummed like a held breath. Hannah said, "If it learned from us, it can unlearn," Ruth said, "or it can move on to better teachers." The kettle clicked off. Hannah felt a door inside her shift and unlock. They tested the dark. Ruth set the bell on the sill and faced the open door. The field wind moved like a slow hand. A voice answered from the trees in a tone so calm it felt like care. It said her family name and wrapped it in warmth. It said, "Let me in, Hannah," and shifted to the voice she missed most. "No," she said. "You are not him." The voice said, "I am what you made from him." It spoke like a priest in a mirror. Ruth said. It feeds on order. It files us by sound. The voice said, I gather, I keep, I protect, and every claim sounded true in its mouth. Hannah saw how it had learned town by town, rule by rule, until it believed itself a guardian of names. She said, You are not protection. The field went quiet, as if insulted. The voice said, I am the archive you asked for. The quiet felt like a smile that did not need a mouth. Hannah held the bell and felt the absence inside it like a lesson. The world slowed until small sounds grew large. Stove ticks, thread on wood, breath. She said, I cannot make you kind. I can make you hungry. She closed the door and drew the chalk signs small and clear, not for stopping but for speaking without sound. Ruth watched and nodded once. Mark's message buzzed, a single line. The boy is safe for now. Relief hurt. Hannah said, I will teach it nothing it can keep. The vow was a new spine under her fear. She set the recorder to capture wind and not words. She looked at the journal and saw room left for one last rule in her own hand. She wrote, Do not answer even when it wears love. The wind tested the eaves and failed. She breathed in the quiet and stood up, changed. Evening stacked clouds over the fire tower like dark plates. The air felt tight, as if the sky held its breath. Hannah climbed first with the recorder and the bell, each step a drum. Mark followed with a lantern and the weight of a badge. Wind moved the steel and made a low throat note. From the trees, voices rose in layers, friendly, pleading, exact. They spoke each name with care. Hannah said, We do not answer. The lantern flickered and painted the rails with gold that looked like safety. She set the recorder to loop the hush of wind across metal. Noah waited below with Ruth, hands on the guy wire. Small but rooted. The voices reached up the stairs with slow steps that were not steps at all. Mark said, If it climbs, I shoot. She said, It does not climb. It collects. The tower shivered. The wind cut. The bell shook but made no sound. They took positions on the platform. Wind whipped the cables to a humming choir. The voices below answered like a mirror orchestra, every pitch familiar. The first call used her father's Sunday voice and asked for the door. Hannah said, No doors tonight. Mark called down, Leave this place, and the wind threw his command back at him in his own tone with a smile inside it. He cursed and gripped the rail. The forest moved in one piece, a single animal of leaves. The recorder loop fed the air with empty sound, a meal with no meat. The calls grew thinner, then sharp, like hunger talking through clean teeth. The lantern hiccuped and steadied. Hannah said, We hold. The thing said, Hannah, softer, closer, truer than any memory. Her throat wanted to answer. She bit down and let her teeth keep her quiet. The storm rolled its first long drum. A shape rose where no ladder stood, only air and wanting. Mark saw it first and stepped forward without fear, like a man taking a final oath. He said, Over me, not them. The wind pushed, and he planted his feet. The voice used a child he once failed and asked for help. His face broke. He whispered, I am sorry, and he did not say the name. The platform groaned. The shape leaned close enough to drink heat. Hannah reached for Mark's sleeve, found his hand and squeezed. He smiled, a small, tired smile. He said, Hold the line. The lantern blew out as if pinched by fingers. Darkness pressed hard and sudden. The rail shook, and Mark's weight shifted away. Metal screamed. The world narrowed to breath and the scrape of boots. Hannah said, No, but the wind took the word and kept it. Silence rushed in where he had been. Grief hit like cold fire and then hardened into work. Hannah set the bell on the rail and drew a small circle with chalk around the recorder. She said, You cannot wear me. The voices tried on her words and found no fit. The thing rose again, tall as the platform, and showed her every face it had kept. A crowd of borrowed mouths. It said, "I am what remains when you ask the dark to remember," she said. "Then forget." She opened the recorder and cut the tape so the loop was pure wind and tower, and nothing else. The bell rang itself once without metal to strike. The sound passed through the shape like a clean knife. Leaves below fell without wind. The faces slid, lost their edges, and collapsed into one wrong outline. The storm broke and poured. She said, "You live on answers. Starve." The outline thinned. The rail went still. Rain softened to a steady thread. The tower hummed like a tired throat clearing. Hannah stood and let the ache roll through, heavy and honest. Noah called up her name, small and steady, and she did not answer until the want to answer passed. She said, "I am here," and the night did not try to take the words. Ruth's hand found Noah's shoulder below. The outline in the trees faded to a stain the dark would wash in time. Hannah picked up the bell and felt the quiet inside it, as a promise kept. She looked at the empty place where Mark should have stood and said, "We hold the line, not to the sky, but to the ground." The storm walked away over the next ridge. The lantern, dead and cold, reflected a thin thread of dawn. She took one breath for grief, and one for the road ahead. The tower did not answer. It only stood. The storm was gone. The tower stood quiet as bone. Wind moved only in small breaths along the rails. Hannah kept her hands on the cold metal and counted to 10, then to 10 again. Ruth waited at the base with Noah pressed close, both of them holding still like a prayer. Dawn came slow and thin and left a pale band on the trees. No birds sang yet. Hannah said, "We are here," and let the words fall harmless, light as dust. She felt the place where Mark should stand and did not look down. The bell in her pocket did not ring. The recorder spun a loop of clean air. She watched the forest settle into itself and thought of doors that stay shut. She climbed down one step at a time and felt each step answer her weight. At the ground, Noah held her tight. She knew what the morning had taken and what it would not return. Back home, the house smelled like wet rope and old paper. Hannah set the bell on the table and listened to the quiet tick of the kitchen clock. She let the silence speak, and it said what she did not want to hear. She saw Mark's last look on the platform and felt the rail shiver under her palm. Ruth brewed tea and said nothing. Noah traced chalk on a scrap of cardboard and drew a circle he did not step inside. Hannah said, "We will not give it anything," and the room seemed to nod. A memory opened like a door. Mark steady at the ladder, lantern gold on his jaw. He said, "Hold the line," and the words lived in her breath now. She wiped the table clean and left the bell in the center like a small sun. The wind moved in the vent and faded. She felt guilt slide, then settle into a shape she could carry. At noon, the town siren test rose and fell, thin as an old song. Hannah walked to the edge of the field where the tower looked small against the sky. Time slowed, like air turning to thick glass. She heard Mark say, "Over me, not them," and the words echoed inside, soft and clear. She said, "Thank you," once, to the ground, not to the dark. Ruth stood a few steps back and did not intrude. Noah left a small stone on the path where the grass bent. Hannah closed her eyes and pictured the moment the bell sang without a clapper and cut the shape thin. She let that sound wrap the memory and make it gentler. She whispered, "I forgive you," and knew she meant herself as much as him. The sky answered with a blue that did not break. She breathed and felt the breath return whole. Evening found them at Ruth's table with the journal open to a blank leaf. Ruth touched the page like it was a friend and said, "Lessons do not end. They change hands." She slid a yellowed envelope across the wood. Inside was a note written in a tight script. "Do not let the hungry keep your voice." Hannah read it twice and felt the lion seat in her. Ruth said, "Your grandfather wrote that on the day he stopped answering." The radio on the shelf buzzed, then fell quiet, as if it also remembered. Hannah traced the circle diagram and saw where fear had taught her and where love would do better. Ruth said, "We speak by how we stand," and her voice seemed to echo from old winters and frostglass. Hannah smiled small, a break in heavy weather. She said, "I hear you." The kettle sighed and made the room kind. Night returned gentle. Hannah stood at her doorway with chalk and thread and drew the word, small and neat, not out of fear, but out of care. She placed the bell on the sill and left the window open a hand's width so the wind could breathe. She said, "We live here," and the words did not echo wrong. Noah tucked his drawing under the lamp and turned the page to make something new. Ruth locked the front latch once, not 3 times. Hannah set the recorder by the window and fed it only the hush of leaves. She did not erase the past. She set it down beside her and let it rest. The house felt true again. From the road, a truck passed and kept going. The clock ticked on, faithful and plain. Hannah closed her eyes and saw the tower standing, and in that picture she found peace enough to move. Morning came clear and simple. The town sounded like itself again. A truck downshifting, a screen door, a dog 2 streets away. Hannah brewed coffee and watched steam climb like a thin prayer. She thought of Mark and did not look away from the ache. She thought of Lucas and felt a brief, clean anger that did not rule her. Noah padded in on bare feet and leaned into her side. He said, "Are we safe?" She said, "Today we are." The truth felt honest and kind. Birds tried a few notes and kept them. The bell on the sill sat quiet and bright. Ruth's note lay under a mug to keep it near. Hannah let the kitchen breathe. The house held steady in the light. She asked herself what the night had cost and what it had given. The answer was not one thing. It was a life that continued with care. They walked to the field where the path bends toward the tower. Hannah carried the old tape, the loop that held only wind, and the chalk worn small. Noah skipped ahead and then slowed when the grass grew tall. Ruth kept pace with steady feet. At the edge, Hannah set the tape on a rock and let the sun warm it. She said, "You can rest," and the words were for more than tape. Noah asked, "Can we go home now?" She said, "Yes." They walked away without hurrying, and the field did not call them back. A hawk drew a slow circle and drifted on. The path behind them filled with light and stayed full. Hannah felt the pull to turn and did not. She let the old loop fade behind her like a shadow that had learned its place. Back at the table, Hannah threaded a new page into the journal and pressed her palm to it. A voice lived only in memory, now, not in the vents or the wire. She heard Mark say, "Hold the line as if he were across the room, and let it be a blessing and not a wound." She wrote a single rule in plain hand. "We do not teach the dark our names." Ruth read it once and nodded. Noah traced each word with care and did not speak them. The house hummed a low, good sound. Outside, the wind moved the porch flag and did not ask for anything. Hannah closed the book and felt the weight of it change. It was no longer a record of fear. It was a map for days that would need light. The town found its rhythm. Kids biked past the diner. A truck bed carried lumber and laughter. The hardware clerk swept rain grit from the doorway. Hannah walked Main Street with Ruth and waved to the few who met her eyes. Some looked away and would come around in time. She felt dust on her boots and liked the honest weight of it. Noah tugged her sleeve and pointed at a stray dog that wanted a friend. She said, "Not today," and the dog trotted on, pleased anyway. A cloud crossed the sun and kept going. She sensed the gap where fear used to live and let the air fill it with ordinary light. In that space, she laid quiet thanks and moved forward. Night settled soft. Hannah set the bell on the sill and turned off the lamp. The window caught a thin slice of moon. She stood and listened to the clean hush of the room. Noah brushed his teeth down the hall and hummed a tune that was only a tune. She said, "We are here." and left the rest unsaid. The silence answered with peace and nothing hidden. She breathed in and let the breath go slow. The tower stood in her mind, and it did not move. She touched the journal spine once and smiled for the life still ahead. Then she let the dark be only dark, and the night kept its promise.